Good morning. Thanks for coming out early this morning. I know it's Saturday morning's a little rough, but we are here together because we are trying to reach new heights as practitioners. So hopefully what I say today will inspire a bit and help you think a little bit. So we are going to be talking today about our relationship with occupation, our collective relationship with occupation. Sometimes it's been really great and we work simpatico together. Other times our relationship has been a little bit rocky. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and a little bit of the history and how we can maybe make things a little bit better. So for starters, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my personal journey with occupation. It's important that I acknowledge where I've been, some of the struggles that I have dealt with, and how I've come out hopefully on top. Then we'll be talking about our collective history with occupation and where we've been and the ebb and the flow and some of the influences on that. And then talk about the loyalty. So if we're talking about this relationship between two entities, the profession or the members of the profession and occupation, we need to get into where our loyalties have been, where they've been strong, where they've wavered. And then we'll talk about reasons for the infidelity. So that's the elephant in the room. We have cheated. We have not been faithful to our partner occupation. Talk about that. And then figure out, how do we patch up the relationship? How do we make things a whole lot better so that we can see our path forward? So first, me and my experiences. So when I was, oh gosh, a very young 17-year-old freshman in college, I had my first occupational therapy class and sat a little quivering in the room, not so sure what I would hear. And the department chair said, "I can take anything that you do during a day and make it occupation." And I was starstruck. I thought, what is this magic of what she speaks? What do you mean anything that we do is occupation? How does that even make sense? But then I learned a whole lot about it before we had language like occupation-based practice. My program, fortunately for me, just happened to be very occupation-based. So that's what I was learning. And that's how I learned to be a practitioner. But then I went out as a new therapist and I was kind of fumbling along, just doing as I had been taught, but I didn't really fit in. I had a little bit of imposter syndrome, thinking this is what I'm supposed to be doing, using all of this occupation, but it's not really fitting with with everybody around me and even with the environment. So then I started to realize that I was always the one who was a little bit different. I was the standout in the clinic. So in the rehab clinic, I would be the one taking out the rope and stringing it across the gym and grabbing towels off the linen cart. And some of them were dry to make them light, and some of them were damp to make them a little heavier. And then I would take all of the clothespins off the roll-in, the resistive clothespins, that dreaded blue box. I would steal all those clothespins and I would hang the towels out to dry. Well, I wouldn't, my client would. And I was the weird one, right? Everyone was like, ha ha, look at Wendy doing laundry with her patients. But I kind of didn't care, marched to the beat of my own drum. But I knew I was doing things a little bit differently and refused to conform, which anybody who knows me, that should not be surprising. Then I entered my doctoral program. So I have a PhD in occupational therapy, and I started learning a whole lot more. The language had evolved so much around occupation, and I learned to articulate better about occupation, about what I was doing in practice, in a way that not only did I believe it and I felt confident about it, but those who I was speaking with were buying into what I was saying. They believe me now. Fantastic. I mean, it's not my personal idea. I was just able to articulate it better. Now I'm at this point where occupation is my superpower. It is what makes me different than anybody else on the healthcare team. It's what I bring to that interprofessional partnership that makes my contribution different than anybody else's. I would argue better than anybody else's, but I'm biased. But it's what makes me different. And it allows me to really check myself that if I'm ever practicing in a way that looks too much like another discipline, am I being my true occupational authentic self? So that's been my journey. Unsteady on my feet in the beginning, not sure how well I could articulate my unique perspective, but now I'm super comfortable with it and I wear it like a badge of honor. So let's talk a little bit about our history. So little over 100 years ago, some very brilliant people got together and said, hey, there's something we should pay attention to between occupation and health. We can date this back to the 1700s with Philippe Pinel, but we won't go through a whole history lesson. Suffice to say, 1917, these folks got together and said, hey, we're noticing in each of our own respective disciplines, because they were nurses, social workers, architects, psychiatrists, not OTs, OT didn't exist. And they said, we're noticing this commonality that when people engage in occupation, they get healthier, they recover. And when people are sick, they can't engage in occupation. But we can perpetuate this positive cycle to improve people's health through occupation. The occupation is the therapeutic medium. And not only fortunately it was also the goal, but that wasn't, the point was that the doing was what was health promoting. So this idea that occupation is the secret sauce, the magic that gets us to health, this became the cornerstone of our profession. It became the central feature of how we documented, how we spoke, what we did, how we set up our clinics, the materials that we had. And this was great. It was a nice, solid foundation of this occupational cornerstone, again, making us different than every other discipline. So things were going along swimmingly for several decades, and along came health insurance. Dun, dun, dun. Right? Health insurance is great because it pays us for what we do, right? But they also say, we will pay you this much to do this. We will not pay you anything to do that. So that really became a little bit of a thorn in our side. It was, again, great because there was a mechanism that somebody would recognize that what we were doing was valuable enough that they would pay us for it. So we were jonesed about that. The problem was that it really led us to this very reductionistic practice for about 3-ish, maybe more decades. I like to call this the dark ages of our profession. We were really focusing on the minutia that insurance companies would pay us for. This was not a good time, and rather than reaching new heights, I would say we were bottoming out in new lows. We're going to turn that arch upside down. So what this really started to look like, remember those occupational cornerstones? With insurance, there were all these places where we could work, which was great. Someone will hire us, someone will pay us money, but the spaces that were available for us to work in were round holes. And we said, great, we'll get hired. I'll squeeze myself right into that little round hole. But what happened was, in order to fit in that round hole, we were shaving off our occupational cornerstones. Not surprising, we started to practice in a way that didn't look true to our authentic selves. So this is sad. Look, we're all shattered and a little bit unrecognizable, but all hope is not lost. In the 1990s, we had this emergence of a lot of language and theoretical perspectives that brought us back to occupation. We had the development of occupational science. We had a whole alphabet soup of theoretical models that really centralized occupation, whether it was PEO, EHP, occupational adaptation, PEOP. We could go on, lots and lots more letters, but they all really centralized occupation. That was good because it gave us something to hold on to, something that was uniquely ours, that we could really say, this is the justification of why I'm practicing in this way. So things, at least theoretically, were so much on the upswing that some of the biggest leaders of our profession, Betty Yerxa, Ann Wilcock, Gail Whiteford, Liz Townsend, so that's Canada, Australia, and the US, big leaders, said we are coming upon an occupational renaissance. We're going to see more and more occupation in practice and in research and in education. We're going to see it sprinkled. We're going to start to see it sprinkled more and more. So that's a good thing. It didn't exactly happen in that wonderful, smooth progression like they had hoped. So, gosh, why didn't it happen? It didn't happen because we have to start looking at the loyalty. I'm not going to blame occupation, and we'll see in a second how loyal occupation has been to us. It was kind of our fault, sorry. So we have to, it's not a nice look in the mirror, but we do have to look in the mirror sometimes. But let's talk about the loyalty. So early on with the founding of our profession, occupation was loyal to us. It was literally given to us as a profession. Any one of these other disciplines, so of our founders up there, we have a social worker, we have a nurse, we have an architect, we have a psychiatrist. Any of them, any of those disciplines could have said, this occupation thing is magical. We are taking it for our own discipline. We're going to use it therapeutically. But instead, it was really gifted to us as a profession. We're it. Occupational therapists, there are some people who would disagree with me, but we are the owners of occupation. Some occupational scientists disagree, but I'm taking ownership of it for us. So it was really belonging to us and was super loyal to us. And we saw over the years, for the last 100 years, whenever it shows up in the literature, in the evidence, when people do research, occupation always comes out as the winner. We find that people are more satisfied with their practice, with their services. We find that they make more improvements. We find that they have shorter lengths of stay. We find that they don't need continued services, so they're not utilizing the system as much because they had occupation in their practice. So it's been really consistent, and I'm personifying occupation. Occupation's been really consistently loyal to us, to the point that there's an allegiance. This is my puppy, Bella. She's not a puppy anymore, but I like this picture. The allegiance from occupation to us reminds me of my dog, that no matter where we've been, whether I've been on vacation for a week, or I was at work all day, or I went to the grocery store, or maybe I just walked to the mailbox and back. Every time I walk back in that door, Bella is like, I'm here for you. Where were you? I missed you so much. I love you. I love you. I love you. Please never leave me again. That's occupation. And no matter how much we have strayed, no matter how much we have dabbled in other approaches and practiced in other ways and didn't represent the truest selves of our profession, occupation has been there for us. It's always there. When we come back, it's there saying, I am ready to show up for you. So occupation gets a gold star on our relationship. When we flip to the other side of the relationship, what we have done, we have not been so loyal. So I actually went to the marketing literature and started researching brand loyalty. So what does it look like when there's some loyalty to some brand? And in this literature, they identify all different types of loyalty, different degrees of loyalty. So that's where a lot of this next section comes from. So they talk about enthusiasts. So when something new comes out, you're like, oh, let me try it. That's great. Let me try. Not so committed to it, but it's new. I'll try anything new. And people jump in a little bit to that. That's where we were kind of at the beginning of our profession. There's a whole category in the marketing literature about shifting loyals, where loyalty changes. Something new and shiny comes along, and we're eager to, let's try out the new shiny thing. So think about our water bottles. I'm seeing lots of water bottles around the room. We started out all drinking out of plastic water bottles. Well, then we realized, well, that wasn't good. So we all got Tervis tumblers. Well, then our water wasn't cold enough, so Yeti came out. Oh, well, Yeti is the best. I'm using it. Oh, wait a second. Hydro Flask is the way to go. Hydro Flask is going to keep my water colder than anything. Oh, Stanley. Stanley has been around for decades. We can trust a Stanley. Oh, but now, ooh, all of you guys can get germs on your straws. We're going to jump to the Awala, right? It's human nature to try out the newest thing, but that's a perfect example of how we've practiced as therapists, that even though something that's been kind of tried and true, like the glass out of the cabinet, filling water out of the tap, that's our tried and true. We keep trying these new things and cupping and dry needling and whatever other technique is sort of the newest on the market. We haven't been so loyal to occupation. We keep trying out new things. There is a category in the literature called hardcore loyals. These are the folks, they are down, die hard. These are the people that get the tattoos of their sports team on their arm, chest, wherever, depends on your gender, depends what you want to show. These are hardcore loyals. And there are those among us who are hardcore loyals to occupation. And they know, no matter the barriers, I'm going to tap into my client's occupation because it's going to make them better. It's hopefully going to decrease their length of stay. It's going to reduce their recidivism rate. So I'm going to stick with it. All right, well, this picture that you're seeing here, this is Liberty Wright. She's an occupational therapy assistant in Oklahoma. This client right here is a cowboy, and he wanted to engage in the occupations of a cowboy. So he had a stroke. And they started off, she actually made this video just simply to show his progress. So he's walking through the hallway. Many of you may have seen this because the video went viral a little bit. Walking down the hallway of the rehab hospital, but he needed to do different kinds of transfers. It wasn't just about transferring on and off the toilet. He had to be able to transfer onto a horse. So she built out of bolsters and rolls, she built horses where he was practicing transferring. He lassoed cattle. He would tie the legs of cattle. And slowly but surely, hopefully I'll get the video playing in a bit. Slowly but surely, he was roping. They would take the therapy stools on wheels and push it across the rehab gym, and he would lasso, maintaining his sitting, right? He had to work on his balance anyway. Sitting in a posture on a horse. This will be nice for the video. Sitting on a horse, straddling a horse, lassoing a stool. They ultimately went out to his farm. They transferred onto a tractor. He was lassoing, I think it was actually a goat on the farm, but using the occupation. Might there have been some handling techniques in between? Yeah, there probably were. But Liberty used occupation. She used what was meaningful to this client to be able to regain health and gain function. The goal was to get onto a horse, but the occupation of transferring those transfers into a contextually relevant position is what they use therapeutically. The last kind of loyalty that they talk about in the literature is relational. Relational loyalists, they explain that while we use a lot of logic to make our choices and decide, I'm going to choose this approach versus that approach, we're also really driven by the emotion of relationships. And we need to call out another elephant in the room. We have a little bit of an identity crisis and wanting to be recognized and have the other disciplines and our clients and their family members recognize and understand who we are and what we do. And in an effort to want to be recognized and seen and validated, we do things that's sort of led us to do things that are recognized. It might not be so true to occupation, but if it's got bells and whistles and it looks official, they'll see me as I'm an official, important discipline because I'm using something that looks skilled, if that makes sense. We'll get to what that is in a little bit. But this relational loyalty is a little bit of a problem because we need to care about what we think about ourselves as opposed to what the other disciplines and the families and the clients think about us. But it does have an influence on what we do. So in this wavering loyalty, it has led to some infidelity. And we have not been so loyal to occupation. Not because we're bad therapists, not because we're not educated, and not because we're lazy. That's like calling a kid bad. We're not lazy. There are realities to practice. And the research shows us that there are very real barriers that limit our ability to use occupation in practice. And they include things like limited equipment. If I'm working in a gym and all they have is a range of motion arc and pegs and TheraBand and TheraPutty with little pegs hidden in it, if that's what I have at my disposal, that's all I can use in practice. So if I don't have occupation-based materials, how can I ever use occupation in my practice? So the things, the equipment and the supplies that I have in my clinic, that really makes a difference. High productivity demands are also a big barrier. So if the expectation is that you'll see client, 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 and I don't have extra time in my schedule, using occupation in practice is time consuming. It means I have to get stuff ready. It means I have to put stuff away. It means I might need to travel to a different space. I go to a completely different part of the building because that's the space I need. It's time consuming. So how do I keep up with these productivity bonuses? Oh gosh, that was a That was a flashback to my 90s days in practice. How do I keep up to these productivity expectations when you're asking me to take all this extra time with materials and travel through the building and extra transfers, et cetera? So that's a very real barrier to using occupation in practice. We also have time constraints, and I would argue that these are perceived time constraints. So if I have people say, well, it takes so long to get stuff and set it up. Well, if you have a 45-minute window to work with a client, why does it matter what you're doing in those 45 minutes? Might as well do occupation. So we don't actually have limited time constraints. It's just that we haven't necessarily found the best ways to, how do I make the most use of that time while I'm getting and sort of cleaning up all the materials that I'm using? Another barrier is shortages of space. Anybody who works in the school system will tell you the closet, the reformed janitor's closet. My area one time was the landing of a stairwell. That was my OT space. But if we don't have a lot of space, or the therapy gym we're working in is really small and I don't have, or I'm working in acute care, all I have are the 4 walls of that hospital room, that's a really limited way to practice, and it's really hard to bring occupation into that space. Also, if we don't have any environmental adaptability, so I only have one type of space. If I only have this one room, I don't have any outdoor areas, I don't have any simulated living area or an actual living area. If everything is just all the same, like I'm working in the ICU, that's it. That's what you got. I can't take somebody who's in the ICU outside for a walk through the garden. That doesn't work. So that is also really limiting. I'm starting to describe a lot of your practice settings, right? Restrictive documentation is also a big barrier. So we have these electronic medical records, which have boxes to check and little spaces to fill in, and that's it. And we're restricted to write about the content that they label for those boxes, and that's it. That's why it's really imperative for us to be on that committee to modify the EPIC system or whatever you're using, because our documentation is really limited. We actually see in some school systems, the IEPs are a pull-down menu. That's it. That's all you got. Whatever those 8 goals or 12 goals are on the pull-down menu, that may or may not have anything to do with the child. That's a limitation in documentation. Client acuity is a reality that if people are too sick, and that does happen, people get really, really sick. Sometimes they just need time to be sick. And when somebody is really, really sick, it's truly difficult to get somebody engaged in occupation. I actually did a study, I was doing a clinic makeover study at a rehab hospital at a time when they were accepting, it was inpatient rehab, accepting people who were more and more acute. Some people died in rehab, like in the rehab gym. People were being discharged to hospice. They were really sick. I would go so far as to say not appropriate for inpatient rehab, but such is healthcare. And the therapists were actually becoming less and less occupation-based, not because they didn't want to use occupation, but because those clients were just so darn sick. So acuity can have a big bearing on how much we use occupation. Also, the client's expectations. This is a big one. Every other healthcare provider they go to, they walk up to that provider and say, I'm sick, make me better. My throat hurts, I have some white spots. Give me an antibiotic and make me better. You fix me. And in rehab, the expectation is You come and you get sort of an exercise protocol to go through. That's the expectation. We were part of creating that expectation. But if that's what people expect, when you try to do something different, clients aren't necessarily happy. So we have to change that expectation. And finally, the exercise culture. Oh my gosh. The exercise culture is prevalent in so many settings, particularly with adults. Lots and lots and lots of exercise. We did a different clinic makeover study, and the therapists, when they were describing themselves, they were going down the list of all the credentials they had in being a geriatric exercise specialist. Things that I'd never heard an OT do before, but they were super proud of it. So we hid all of the non-occupation-based materials, and we brought in boxes of occupation-based kits. We had gift wrapping and money management and grooming and laundry and golf and car washing and laundry and woodworking and painting, and obviously we outfitted the whole kitchen. People were getting strengthening by cooking with a cast iron pan. I don't cook with a cast iron pan because it's too heavy for me. But that's how we were strengthening folks. And ultimately, the clients were actually getting discharged sooner. It was really not officially designated, but like a continuous care retirement community. So people who were living independently in apartments would be in rehab, but then they'd get discharged back to their own apartment. So we found that they were getting discharged sooner, so they had shorter lengths of stay, but the therapist still said, "Oh, if I could just have like 4 more days with them to work on strengthening." This 93-year-old lady cooked you an egg in a cast iron pan and washed the pan. That's strengthening. So even the understanding of how important exercise is, they're getting exercise. Somebody who's 93 years old is not training for a triathlon. They need to get strong enough to live their lives, not bulk up. So all of these are very real barriers to using occupation in practice. We don't want to ever forget the benefits of using occupation in practice. The literature tells us time and time again that we get better outcomes from using occupation. That would be like me telling you, just take Tylenol for your strep throat. Eventually it'll get better. If we know the antibiotic is better and is more likely to knock out that bacteria, that's what we should be using. So we know that it works a whole lot better. We know that it's inherently client-centered because occupation is not the same as activity. Occupation is things that are personally meaningful to the client. So I have no choice but to really identify who that person is as an occupational being. You tell me what's important to you. You tell me what occupations you need to engage in. If I'm truly using occupation and not activity, it's what's important to them, and they are the ones who are driving their practice. It's also allows us to really focus on culturally relevant occupations. So it's not about me and my culture. It's about the culture of the client and how they live their lives and what their customs are. I worked in Miami for a long time, and about 80% of my clients were Spanish speakers. So I was working in rehab, and I had a lovely gentleman with a total hip replacement, and I'm trying to teach him about getting dressed with his hip precautions. And at this hospital, we had a closet with just supplies that we could give away. Dressing sticks, reachers, long-handled shoe horns. So here I am teaching him. here, you're going to use this. You'll put your shoes and socks on like this. And he tells me in Spanish, I don't need that. I have a wife. And I'm like, no, it's free. Don't worry about it. It's a gift from the hospital. In Spanish, I don't need that. I have a wife. Now, here I'm coming at this with my OT culture. What's important to me and my very independent thinking. I'm from New England. You pull your bootstraps up and do it yourself. No, don't worry. It's really easy. I'll teach you. Don't worry. And he tells me again in Spanish, I don't need that. I have a wife. And I thought, I'm not a native Spanish speaker, but I was pretty good. I was speaking Spanish all day long, cooking groups, community reentry, all in Spanish. Let me back it up here. And I really talked to him about what was going on, and he explained to me, my wife has been putting on my shoes and socks for 30 years. Why would that change now? And it hit me like a truck. Oh my God, I'm imposing my cultural views, my values on this person. And in his culture, that is fairly common. If you're ever working like in Miami, the Cuban culture, it's a very male-dominated culture, and the wife is managing the household and taking care of the husband and the cooking and the cleaning. But I was imposing my views on my client. So I was like, oh, okay, well, if this was me, I'd be going right to a divorce attorney, but not my marriage, right? It's not about me, it's about my client. So I had to shift what I was doing, bring the wife in and say, hey, when you put his shoes and socks on, here are the movements you can't do with his leg or you'll dislocate the hip. So again, if I'm really focusing on what's meaningful to my client, I never would have tried to have him put his own shoes and socks on. I didn't ask him. I didn't even think to say, tell me about how you get dressed in the morning. They're moving furniture upstairs. It's also really DEI friendly, because if I'm focusing on occupations that are identified by my client, it doesn't matter if I'm white, I have white hair. If my client is African American and they have to do their hair, I need to get down with what they need to work on. I need to recognize my client is the expert in their life, in their occupation, because it's about them. So whether it's a trans woman who wants to shave her legs, or it's a different hairstyle, or a different custom, or a different kind of clothing, it's really about the client. And if it's occupation-based, it's going back to who they are as an occupational being and what's meaningful to them. So it's kind of like a 2-for-1, right? 3-for-1. Occupation, which is good for you, client-centered, and culturally responsive. So using occupation is not easy. This is actually from the first clinic makeover study we did, the one where the 93-year-old was cooking with a cast iron pan. So this curve is actually, it's used in business, but it actually is a reflection from Mildred Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. And it goes through the process of change. So early on in the study, what's the impact of change? So we went in and we took away all of their exercise material. We put it in a closet. Interestingly, the next day when we went back, they found a chain. It was plastic, but they found a chain. They put the chain through the handles of the door and put a padlock on it, because they didn't think they couldn't trust themselves not to revert back. So at the very beginning, when there's change, you're operating with the status quo. But not too long after that, there's disruption. Oh my gosh, what do I do? Like, where's my weighted dowels? Where's my half-pound weight that I put on the person's wrist? Where are all my things that I use in practice? And it's very disruptive. And people were angry at first. This facility, by the way, it was the CEO of the whole organization was an OT. She wasn't involved in rehab at all, but the rehab director was on board. The CEO of the whole company wanted this change to happen. So we went in and did this study. But people were angry. You took my stuff. You took my tools. That's like asking me to cook in the kitchen without a wooden spoon. You took my tools. Now what do I do? So things started to elevate a little bit as they went through this process of exploration. And what are all the things we could do? And we did have to do a little bit of sort of OT 101. We had a whole thing set up with table setting. So we had tablecloth and plates and placemats and flatware. And they said, like, why would we use this? Like, tell us an instance why we might do table setting. I was like, wow, well, we got balance, we got endurance, we got sequencing, we got problem solving, we have judgment, we have dynamic balance. I can use table setting for a lot of different things. But they weren't even making those connections anymore because they were so habituated to use exercise. Eventually, they got to this point of rebuilding, and they ended up better than they were at the beginning. Grateful. And at the start of the study, most people told us that they do about 75% exercise. And at the end of the session, about 25% of their time is occupation. At the end of the study, which was 5 months of data collection, that had completely swapped. They did 25% exercise and 75% occupation. So we took that as a win. So gosh, why is it so hard? Why is it so hard for us to just use occupation? When it seems so obvious, all the things point us in the right direction. So I like to look to the diffusion of innovation theory, which came out originally in the 60s, but it explains how new ideas and new technologies are adopted, how they kind of infuse their way into society and into culture. And the beginning of the curve, these are innovators. These are the folks who have the ideas, small percentage of the population, only 2.5%. These are the people who are like, I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna go out on a limb. I'm gonna take a risk, and I'm gonna try something totally new. But the interesting thing is that occupation's not new. It's new to us, right? Because we weren't practicing 100 years ago. But there are those innovators who will take the risk and be the first to try something. Then there's another chunk of the population. These are the early adopters. These are the folks who know there needs to be a change and they're comfortable trying out something new. The next chunk is the early majority. So these are the folks that they're a little bit cautious. They want to see that there's evidence and there's proof that it really works, but then they jump on board. The late majority are people who are super comfortable in their habits, and they take a whole lot more convincing. I'm comfortable with the way I've been practicing. It's been working. I know how to document. I know how to bill. The reimbursement's coming until it doesn't come, because we do see that claims get denied because what we're doing and what we're documenting isn't unique from what's already being done. And then the very last group, those are what we call the laggards or the skeptics. These are the people there so stuck in their ways. So if we think about like cell phone technology, there were those people who, when the iPhone came out, remember the first iPhone came out? We all had that relative, maybe it was one of you, but we all that relative, I have to get it. I have to be the first one. I have to be the first one. And we were all admittedly a little amazed that you could you can just scroll through pictures. That was pretty remarkable. But those were the really early people. And then you have your grandmother who's still using the flip phone. That's the laggard, right? Eventually we all caught up and we came over, but we all have a grandmother who's still using that flip phone or the phone with the big buttons. So it would be lovely if this is how change happened and it was this smooth. The reality is there are some gaps, particularly between the early adopters and the early majority. That is always referred to as a chasm, the big chasm. How do we get these folks to adopt occupation? Why is it so hard for us all to come over? And it's interesting that the next image shows a little bit more about what people are thinking. Why are we having a hard time making the leap over that chasm? All right, so these early adopters, they have something new and they really want it. But then we have this chasm because we have this big group over here that says, huh, that looks interesting, but is it for me? They're a little bit more skeptical. So all these skeptics that things are going well for them, they're not so eager to jump on to something. Oh, there it goes. Not really so sure they're going to jump on and go for it. And then our late majority, they're big skeptics. Look at those weirdos over there. What are they up to? Like, what are they even doing? We're getting reimbursed just fine by using these really reductionist techniques. Why are they using occupation? And then the laggard, this guy says, I want my fax machine back. Those are the people who they're never changing. We're not going to try to convince them to change, but change is really, really difficult. So I love Rogers' diffusion of innovation theory, but I love these interpretations with this idea that there's a chasm, because it's a cool word, and you don't hear the word chasm very often until you read my very favorite Mary Riley quote. So this is not her famous quote. It is the quote that was in that same Slagle lecture, but she was very clear when remember the name of that lecture is about occupation being the great new idea of the century, that we should really latch onto it. But she was very real and said, the wide and gaping chasm which exists between the complexity of illness and the commonplaceness of our treatment tools is and always will be both the pride and anguish of our profession. Think about that. The complexity of illness is over here. All the illnesses and social and health conditions that we deal with are really complex. But if our treatment tool is occupation, it looks so ordinary and commonplace. On the one hand, that's pretty amazing. It's pretty magical that we are able to harness the power of occupation to treat these complex illnesses. That's amazing. By the way, no one else does it. No one else harnesses the power of occupation. Amazing. That's a source of pride for us. The anguish is there's this really complex illness and you're having the person crochet? What? That doesn't look very legitimate. It doesn't look very skilled, even though you know you are tapping into this person's meaning. You're doing problem solving. You're working on their coordination and their endurance and whatever they need to work on. You have custom designed and custom adapted this commonplaceness of, we'll call it crocheting. It could be anything. And it doesn't have to be crafts. It could be anything. But we have customized and we have used our very adept skills at activity and occupational analysis and grading activities to create the just right challenge out of something so simple, out of occupation, to make this curative for this illness. That's amazing that we can do that. No one else can say that. The problem is it doesn't look fancy. It doesn't have bells and whistles. It's so simplistic. There's a great book. Unfortunately, it's out of print, which means you can probably get it for less than $2. It's called Ordinary Miracles, and it's edited by Deborah Leibovitz. And she interviewed tons and tons of OTs, and they told stories about what they did with clients that for them, it was just, I'm just being an OT. But for the client, it was a miracle. There's a story about this, and it's a great book. So if you can find it on Amazon for a couple bucks, I would get it. You can just open it up. Each story is maybe 2 or 3 pages long, and you don't have to go in order, and you can just pick any story and read it. There's a story about this family, this little girl had CP, and she had 2 older brothers, and they just so wanted to play with her. But she didn't have good sitting balance. They just wanted to be able to eat with her and play with her. And the OT was just being an OT. What she did was magical. She built this little girl a corner chair. So simplistic, right? Looks so commonplace. The family was elated because this kid could now sit up and play with her brothers and eat with her brothers because she could sit up. Looks so ordinary. I just gave her a different chair. But that's miraculous about what OT can do. It's super powerful. The book, it's called Ordinary Miracles. Deborah Leibovitz, she was at NYU for a long time. Unfortunately, she passed away. But brilliant work just by putting stories together. So here we are now. There are some relationship troubles. And we need help. We need to get on better terms with occupation. So what we really need to do is turn things around, and we need to reach towards these new heights to practice in the best way that we know that we can be effective, we can make some meaningful difference, we can probably decrease healthcare costs. We need more research on that. But if we can decrease length of stay, gosh, that saves everybody money. That's brilliant. So I looked to the literature in family therapy. At first, I was going to look up couples therapy, but the reality is it's no longer just us and occupation. There are a lot of other folks involved in this relationship now. We have clients and family members who hear us and perceive us in a certain way. We have doctors who write orders. We have PTs. We have all these folks who are now part of the family, and it's time for some family therapy. We're beyond couples therapy. It's too late for that, but there's hope. So the principles of family therapy, as it turns out, not my practice area, this is where the literature came from. The 3 main principles of family therapy are improve communication, set clear boundaries, and embrace change. Those are the 3 steps to family therapy. So for starters, with improving communication, we need to start looking at how we talk about ourselves, the language that we use. We should never shy away from the word occupation. I one time was writing with a student who said, I think we use occupation too many times in that sentence. And I said, no, that's like being too rich or too thin. You can't use occupation too much. It is what we do. I had a doctoral student one time who said, it's our first name. Shouldn't we go by it? 100%. So we need to think about how we talk about ourselves. how we introduce ourselves. When we're in a team setting at rounds, are we talking about how much range of motion somebody has or how much strength they have? Or we talk about, these are the occupations where this person has made progress. Here's where they still need to get to before that person can go home or be discharged. So we really need to start using that language and changing the way that we talk about ourselves. And it's going to help if we get a big O on our chest. I'm not going to say a tattoo. We'll put it on a t-shirt, right? A big O for occupation. Wear it like a badge of honor. How we talk to clients is important. I never like using the term OT with clients. What is it, overtime? I mean, I don't want them to interpret, which is why I really don't like the acronym OTP for occupational therapy practitioner. You're just adding more confusion. How much of a rush are you in that you can't say occupational therapy? It's only a few more syllables. But when I talk to clients, I make an assumption that they don't really know what I do, because how many people know what we do? So when I introduce myself to somebody, I say, hi, how are you? My name is Wendy. I'm your occupational therapist. I don't know if you've ever had occupational therapy before, but something that's really unique about what we do is that we use the activities that are meaningful in your everyday life as your therapy. Set the expectation from day one. We're not going to the gym. You can go to Lifetime Fitness for that. We work on occupation. That's our medicine. You go to a doctor for antibiotics, you come to an OT for occupation. But set that expectation early. We need to look at how we document what we do and really document occupation. Document how people are engaging in occupation. What occupations are still inaccessible to that person. How much assistance they needed with occupation. We get so bogged down in how much balance somebody has or how much strength somebody has, because we've let everybody else in our relationship come to expect that from us. So we need to be really clear in our communication and say, this is how we talk. We talk in occupation. That's our thing. And the last one is advocating for our needs. And that advocacy can be anything from somebody wants to co-treat with you and you say, not today. I really need to spend some time focusing on this occupation. Or advocating for equipment or space, or not everything costs money. Advocating for changes in our documentation, that's a big area for us to advocate in. Advocate to have our services paid for, that we shouldn't be, lumped in with anybody else. Advocating to the insurance company and explaining this is our scope of practice, and really speaking out on our own behalf. So that's ways that we can improve our communication. We also need to set really clear boundaries. In this image, everything inside this image, this is us. Oh my gosh, we have a lot going on. There's a lot of stuff we do. If you've read the practice framework, holy moly, our scope of practice is big. I don't know how we have room or time for all these other things that aren't truly us. But we need to set really clear boundaries around, this is my box. This is what I do. I don't want you encroaching in my box, and I won't step out of my boundaries. We have so much already to work on, that we need to be really clear about holding strong to what we do. Historically, we've given up a lot of practice. Certainly in the area of mental health, we've given that away in very devastating ways. But we need to really hang on to that as our boundary. So recognize what those boundaries are, which might vary a little bit at different facilities, but and in different companies, but keep in mind what our boundaries are. That last principle is about embracing change. So in embracing change, we need to think about our terminology usage and really get comfortable using occupation. Use that language, know what an occupation is versus an activity, and use that language, and we should be writing about it. When the insurance company reads our documentation, it should look very different than what the PT wrote or what the speech therapist wrote or what the social worker wrote. We also want to really embrace the full range of occupations. And I would say in every practice area, we have been so pigeonholed. In adult practice, it's ADLs. That's it. You get to work on ADLs. That's your scope. No, it's not. The practice framework lists many, many, many occupations that people need to engage in. Maybe they don't use that as your goal occupation because the insurance company doesn't care if you can go fishing. But if fishing is a really meaningful occupation, wow, that's going to be able to work a lot on balance and safety and coordination and impulsivity and range of motion when I'm casting that rod. There's no rules that say the goal occupation can only be used as the intervention. Here's our goal occupation, and there are 97 other occupations that we can use to get here. So every practice area, so adults were pigeonholed to ADLs. Peds, we are so, especially school system, so pigeonholed to handwriting, it makes me want to tear my hair out. In the school system, kids go to the bathroom, they eat, they play, they engage in social participation. Maybe there's some leisure, they rest at nap time, they have chores, so they do work. There's a lot of occupations that kids engage in beyond handwriting. And we need to recognize there's a whole range of occupational engagement that is our scope of practice that we should be supporting. In mental health, it's not just about anger management and time management. I mean, people engage in real occupations. They travel on buses, they get dressed, they manage their money. There's lots and lots of occupations. So we need to take a step back and say, wow, we've really been limited. And we need to stop letting the other members of our family limit us. We need to own that. We also need to conceptualize occupation. If we understand it on a little bit deeper level, it makes it a whole lot easier to use it in practice. There are lots of ways to conceptualize it. Some would say through form, function, and meaning. Some say through doing, being, becoming, and belonging. I am super biased when I present this because this is my model from the dynamic model of occupation-based practice that says, how do we know if what we're doing is occupation-based? So picture in your mind any therapeutic interaction that you're doing with a client, whether it's brushing teeth or a transfer or playing or whatever it may be, and think about, are you using authentic occupation? Is it an occupation? Is it using the materials that an occupation would normally use? Are you actually taking a hairbrush and having somebody brush their hair? Or are you giving them a pen that happens to be in your pocket and say, pretend this is a brush and show me how you would brush your hair? That's not an authentic occupation. Is it being done in the context where that occupation would ordinarily happen? If you're going to be washing somebody's hair, please, pretty please, do it in the bathroom. That's in a shower. That's where people wash their hair. I had a client, or I was doing a study, and the therapist took the client and didn't wash her hair, but there are those conditioner caps that you put in the microwave to heat it up. And so they, on the way past the nurse's station, got the cap, put it on her head, drove her down to the clinic, to the rehab clinic, and said, okay, we're going to work on your hair now. First of all, who just does their hair in public in the middle of a rehab gym, sitting on a mat, and gave this woman a comb, no mirror, just staring out into the rehab gym? And the lady goes, I sure wish I had a mirror. Yeah, no kidding. So think about the context where we provide our services. Are we actually doing something, or is it just a rote movement? So that's authentic occupation. Is there meaningful and purposeful value? So is it valuable to the person and important to the person, or is it important to you as a therapist? Is there therapeutic intent? And I know this sounds silly, but we do a lot of things in practice to eat away therapy minutes. I got to get my 45 minutes in. Here, take this wad of Theraputty and pull out all the pegs. How many are in there? I don't really know. You'll know when they're all gone. That's not nice. That's not nice, and we all know that. But look how many therapy minutes you're eating away. So really be intentional about what you're selecting. And are you truly being therapeutic? Are you adapting it as you're going along? Maybe the way you position the materials aren't within reach, or because of somebody's abnormal movement pattern, they can't get to it, or you want to challenge them to, I don't know, rotate their shoulder in a different way. Just something as simple as, let me just move this over here a little bit to find that just right challenge, versus setting somebody up and going across the room to do your documentation. And the last construct of occupation-based practice is engaged participation, and that's a two-way street. So is the client actively engaged, or are they passively receiving ultrasound or whatever? And are you as a therapist actively engaged using therapeutic use of self, or you're just kind of supervising what they do? So if we think about that and know that sometimes the things that we do in practice are not going to meet these criteria. There are have-tos. If I'm a hand therapist and I'm removing sutures, that's not occupation. It's a have-to. Or I'm teaching somebody about their total hip precautions. That's a have-to. There are things that are not occupation-based in our practice that we have no choice but to do. But if we can be conscious about, in my 45-minute period, I do 7 different things, right? A transfer, some education, some exercise, some functional mobility, whatever. I do 7 different things. If some of those things cannot be occupation-based, I want to be really intentional on making sure the other things that I'm doing are occupation-based, because the more occupation we can infuse, the better. So if we're going to reach new heights, which we are trying to do, we need to really embrace occupation, and value it for what it is and wear it like a badge of honor. It is our superpower. All of us, it's our superpower. And we also need to change the context. So if you think about all of those barriers I mentioned, remember I said, it's not because we're lazy, it's not because we're bad therapists, it's not because we haven't been trained, it's because there are things around us, the context that we practice in, things like the documentation, the billing, the space, the culture. That's all part of the context and environment. They are bogging us down in not a good way. So rather than shaving off our occupational corners, because this is sad, right? We want to be who we really are. Rather than shaving off our occupational corners, we should be changing the practice context. Hold on to those occupational corners. They're strong. They're valuable at what makes us unique. And we need to be shaking things up in our documentation and our materials and the culture and the way other people understand us. Getting back to thinking about the practice, sorry to be like a class, but thinking about the practice framework and the physical environment and the social environment with everybody else in that family, and the materials and the resources and the organizational environment that we engage in. So the billing and the documentation and the cultural context, that's all where we practice, and it's holding us back. So we need to really bust things up a little bit and change that context. Because our professional goal, this is our goal, that we should stop doing what they'll pay us for and get paid for what we do. There's a difference. There's a huge difference here. The people who pay for our services should recognize that they should. Trust me, you want to pay for occupation. You're getting way more bang for your buck if you pay for us to do occupation. And I realize that to shape things up a little bit, in some ways, it's what happens in our little clinic. In other ways, we're talking like federal and changing CPT codes. Don't get me started on that. But why is there no CPT code about occupation? We're so limited in our CPT code. So the advocacy we need to do is from very micro to how I talk to the doctor who writes my orders, to the documentation system in my company, to the state for reimbursement, to the federal level for reimbursement, to AOTA saying, hey, you need to advocate for all of us on that behalf. We need to change that context. So I invite you all. Oh, the colors got messed up when I changed it. This is supposed to say occupational revolution. When I downloaded it, it got a little goofy. I join you all to join the occupational revolution, because an occupational renaissance is not enough. It's time to really take control and own occupation and be empowered by it, because it's always been there for us, and it's time to be equal partners again. Thank you.